right, folks, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and I thank you for it. Got a great conversation for you today. My guest is Shane Burley. He is a writer and filmmaker, someone based out of Portland, Oregon, or maybe based in Portland, Oregon, both of those things. Either way, Portland kind of caught my attention in part because it's been the site of so much political chaos in the last several years with, a sort of very active left and very active right along that Pacific Northwest corridor. It's come up on the show a number of times, and I wanted to talk to Shane about that and about the sort of larger fabric of fascism and American culture and where we're headed right now. His latest book is called Why We Fight: Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse. Go check that book out and check out Shane's other stuff. He's someone who is writing about the right a lot, but also strategies for revolution, really, on the left and right. So this was a sort of classic Nostalgia Trap conversation. I had a lot of fun talking with Shane. I hope you enjoy it. We've got a lot more stuff on our Patreon. If you want to join the club, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've been doing live streams every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. That's 2 p.m. Eastern time. If you can't make the live stream on our YouTube channel, you can, if you're a subscriber, you can listen anytime. And those live streams are conversations between Justin Rogers Cooper and I about the events of the week or our own encounters with aliens as we got into last week. Lots of weird, fun stuff on there. Check it out. Support the show. We appreciate it. Enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Shane Burley. Thank you so much for joining me. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. You've got a number of interesting books and a new one coming out right now that I want to talk about. Maybe I can just say the name of your most recent book, which is called Why We Fight: Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse. That's the book title that caught my attention because we talk so much about, apocalypticism and this notion of fascism on the show a lot. I just want to thank you, first of all, and point out to everyone that Shane's writing talks about fascism in a dynamic way. And you have a definition of fascism that's sort of a fluid definition that is not, I think you know what I'm talking about, and you actually reference this in your writing. There's so many like nerds on social media who are like, actually, fascism is a result of 4 historical preconditions, and these are the ones that must be matched, and if they're not, then I conclude that fascism does not exist today, and it is not possible. How did you like begin writing about fascism as a concept? Because I think you began several years ago, and kind of how do you even dive into like beginning to define what's going on in America with the right?
Yeah, I mean, I came to it in the early days of the alt-right, before folks like Richard Spencer were household names, when it was pretty new. And that sort of comes with how I defined it, because what you see there is people conforming to patterns, to existing patterns. And I think if the term fascism matters, like if it's something that describes a real political phenomenon, then it has to describe it today, just like it did, in earlier conditions. They're right. There's a lot of these people that will like check these weird boxes, assume that fascism has to take on this very specific political formation. And if that was the case, then it would have been a thing of the past. It just wouldn't exist anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like parties don't have the same force they once had. It would be exceedingly rare to see a political party have a militia or like like an armed component. Even concepts like nationhood don't exist in quite the same way. Everything's just different. That's the point. And so
right.
If we want to describe what this has in common with that, then we have to find something more diffuse. And you find that in their ideology and their conception of themselves, the way that they see changing politics. And so a fascism today, quote unquote, would be one that conforms to, horizontal social movements and cultural elements and things like that. So it just has to function different if it's going to have any kind of continuity to the past.
A lot of what you describe in the introduction to your book is about kind of growing up in the 80s and 90s with a very particular kind of politics and a very particular apocalypticism
Mhm.
around the millennium. I mean, I remember Y2K being like a part of that, but there's something in the religious element as well. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that and your own sort of like being surrounded by this apocalypticism, because I got it from a secular place. I got like apocalypticism from Hollywood movies, those Schwarzenegger movies you mentioned, those sort of like end of days movies. And then when 9/11 happened, sort of seemed to like confirm so much of all that stuff that was kind of turning in the culture. But I wonder if you can address the religious element of it, because I think it's something that a lot of the left doesn't really know too much about, honestly.
Mhm.
It's sort of like they have a kind of like distorted vision of what Christianity is and what its end days sort of the relationship to apocalypticism is.
Yeah, I think it's important to also think about what secular politics actually are, which
Mm.
is just a slightly reformed religious politic most of the time. I would say most of the time. There's actually a far right scholar that called it political theology, called like liberalism, political theology. And that, in a way, there's a certain kind of truth to that we actually do kind of replay religious structures. So like I talk about later in that book, I talk about anti-Semitism, and
Mm-hmm.
modern anti-Semitism is really the secularization of Christian beliefs about Jews, right? They take the
Mm.
Christianity out of it and they give pseudoscientific reasons that conform to those old kind of notions. And so with apocalypticism, yeah, I mean, what you have is obviously the entrenchment of the Christian right, and it's based very, very heavily on apocalypticism and a kind of millennialist understanding of the coming end times that gives it its energy. And that's
Mm.
also the time in which the Republican Party shifted really profoundly. Reaganism as a really right-wing figure still doesn't conform with what the Republican Party became in the late 80s and early 90s with the influx of Pat Buchanan and more importantly Pat Robertson and the kind of creation of this New World Order conspiracy theory that underlies really all of the party today in a lot of ways. He was obviously he's a pastor, the 700 Club and TBN, but those ideas, they are secularized all the time, so we're constantly living in that mode, and that really is the story of Western culture, at least US Western culture. It has this strong sense of apocalypticism that runs in everything. So you mentioned those kind of secular Hollywood culture of
Mm-hmm.
disaster. That really is a Christian culture of the end times. You look at non-Christian narratives, they simply do not end in that way. They do not have this cataclysm and this kind of like post-apocalyptic kind of purity, but that is existing all around us. It's almost like that has reframed our ability to think about things like the environment and a particularly Christian narrative, which like is
Yeah.
incredibly limiting for how we can think of how to survive such a thing or how we can think to challenge such a thing, because that has such a kind of implicitly religious flavor to it, even when you strip out the Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are so many different American roots to apocalypse. I think, and in thinking of like, um, I don't know, for a lot of people, I think apocalypse is some sort of like hope of that we'll escape the doldrums of this life, and somehow one day I won't have to go to my job anymore because the entire world will be on fire and that sort of thing. There's that element of it, but there's also like I don't know. I came to it, and I've mentioned this in the show a couple times. I came to like a weird sort of fringe apocalyptic notion that maybe wasn't so fringe was like the 2012 Mayan apocalypse. Do you remember this? And there were
Yeah.
a lot of people on the
Oh yeah.
left that were into that in like the 2000s, that were connected to psychedelic culture.
Like Daniel Pinchbeck and that kind of crew of folks.
Yes, I've had him on the show. Daniel Pinchbeck, Terrence McKenna, and then Pinchbeck actually is writing now about sort of like, oh my God, like what happened to Burning Man and like all that culture,
Yeah.
because you're on the West Coast too. You're in Portland, like I'm in Southern California. Like I'm surrounded by a lot of that New Age culture, and I don't know. It kind of like there's a fascist edge to that,
Mm.
if that makes sense, and it seems like it's been going further in that direction.
Yeah, one thing I think is interesting about these fantasies about the end of the world is that they assume that the end of the world sort of frees you from the doldrums of your life, but the reality is things are getting bad and I still have to fucking go to work.
Right,
I
right.
still have to pay my bills. Who knew that the end of the world was going to come with like crushing debt that you still had to pay? So like it's sort of the worst version of the apocalypse you're living through.
Totally,
Real
yeah.
silver
It's
linings.
the Fight Club apocalypse, right? At the
Yeah.
end of Fight Club, they're like the whole plan, as I recall, is Brad Pitt's character is like we're gonna erase the debt record so that like
Yeah.
we'll go back to zero, and there's like this fantasy that like we won't be going. That's a very American thing too, the sense that like somehow we'll just kind of like overcome all those the like worst elements of that. When
As if that's how debt worked,
right,
as
right,
if, and that's sort
held
of
in a
what
building somewhere.
right, yeah, this like populist notion that it's simple. You just pull you pull the Jenga block out and it'll all come collapsing, as if debt wasn't like the infrastructure that like was came before even money became before Western nations. So
Right.
yeah, it's something that I think people are obsessed with the idea that I think in a way it's a quick fix understanding of the apocalypse. It's like just break the thing down, we'll be able to rebuild, instead of saying that actually collapse is super painful for most people. There are like opportunities when things sort of collapse because you can build something in its stead. And that I think people should look at the positive and these sorts of things, say, okay, what good can come out of the situation? But let's not kid ourselves thinking that somehow collapse is something that's great. We don't all just become like, warriors in the model of Walking Dead, like it's simply not the case.
And collapse is going to be like something felt globally in such an unequal way too. It's like a really
right,
kind of
and
chauvinist idea to be like, oh, collapse is when like my middle class lifestyle ends in America, rather than understanding that collapse is already happening to people all over the world, and something that would in terms of waves of collapse, economic and climate and otherwise, Americans are pretty sheltered from a lot of that stuff globally. Not that it's not going to twist our politics, which I think is part of what you're writing about.
But I mean that this is also part of why we're talking about the coming apocalypse and not the current apocalypse.
Right.
I mean, right now the supply chain is breaking down. Like there's like destabilization all across the world right now. There's things that are basically thinly veiled water and energy wars. Like there's a sort of proxy instability that's starting to take place that we are largely insulated from. Not completely insulated. I mean, we're starting to see those cracks, and we'll see them more and more, like you're saying. I think when it comes to the new age stuff, I think there's an interesting dynamic by which, and this is like I think the critique that of people like Pinchbeck that's really, really useful, is that it doesn't really matter what you put on top of society, psychedelics, new agey beliefs, half-assed spiritualism. It doesn't really matter when you don't actually do anything about the conditions of it. And this is sort of like the issue that's raised, I think, in Pinchbeck in a useful way, is that, he'll write about the way that, ayahuasca or whatever, like expands consciousness, changes human dynamics. But do they really? If they were changing dynamics, why would he have to put out apologies for sexual improprieties? Like if they really had changed who he was. I think the reality is that it actually doesn't change those things. Like maybe ayahuasca is helpful. I don't know. I'm not a doctor that could predict that, but it doesn't change the fundamental underlying structure of society. It doesn't change patriarchy, doesn't change the inequalities of capitalism, right? So I think you have to look at those conditions. The other thing is that new age stuff is so distinctly American in that it takes very complicated beliefs, mutates them through Orientalism, and just spits them back in consumer properties. Like things like Wicca, for example, is entirely manufactured religion, just a hodgepodge of occultism kind of created and repackaged. This is, we both live on the West Coast, so I'm sure we all well traveled around the kind of hippie reinterpretation of Hinduism and Buddhism that doesn't really hold any of this like strong rigors of the traditions in which they're trying to appropriate from. So I in a way,
this is all the legacy of the 60s you're describing.
Right.
And
that's why. And I'm not wild about baby boomer 60s activism in a lot of ways. I think like the most criticism can be leveled at that because in the inability of challenging power, they just started challenging each other with these kind of like cultural mores. And again, I have no, if people feel really moved by Buddhism, they should jump in full force. I nothing but respect for that. But that doesn't make it a political and social revolution,
Right. Well, it's American in the sense of change the individual and you change society, right? Like there's some sort of sense of like I'm enlightened and liberated now, and so that therefore I'm a better citizen somehow.
And that's a Christian idea, right? That's taking Moshiach, the Messiah, that which was a political sense in Judaism of like totally revolutionary society, and then making it about you, a personal Messiah, Jesus, which is just simply about personalizing very radical transformations. We're no longer talking about disheveling society, right? We're not talking about building heaven on earth. We're just talking about it within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of abandon all those other sorts of things. And so I think, again, you have Christianity, and what like folks like Magna Tita are just saying is Christian supremacy. Like every piece of the society reflects its Christian origins. It doesn't matter how secular it becomes, you know?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like that new age thing it intersects with the sort of like Christian entrepreneurial capitalism ideas, right? I've seen so many of these kind of think and grow rich type of ideologies that are literally about, I don't know, so much of like the early dabblings with this Eastern religion and mysticism that white people were getting into in the 60s, the counterculture, seems like it had a flavor of like, well, we're in an emergency, the Vietnam War is happening, the civil rights movement. You know, in that political context, it seemed like a path through that in some way. But at some point, it gets grafted onto just regular old American capitalism. And you have like YouTube videos of guys who are saying like, open your third eye and see financial freedom, you know,
Right.
like that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know where there is hope in those sorts of cultural permutations, but at the same time, seeing how much of it is weaponized, like on Instagram, influencer accounts, it seems like the right more owns that stuff than the left now. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
It had a kind of like
think it
left
does.
tinge, and it seems more right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I have a bunch of my father's buds when I was growing up had been Rajneeshis, which is, you know, which was obviously this kind of cultic movement in Eastern Oregon that basically did mix a version of kind of like integrated South Asian spirituality, but with a real hyper capitalism to it, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
really proprietarian kind of focus.
Is this the wild, wild country people?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And that eventually collapsed, and a lot of those people went off to other new age cults like Ramtha and other ones that are, again, about funneling money to people, about selling products, which is why you see such a focus on kind of like sham medicine, because that's the easiest way to just pump money into a group. And
That
I
seems
think,
like the connection right there. The right is the anti-vax thing. Like
I
that
think
seems like a place where there's a lot of growth for that.
totally. I also would question, you know, this happens a lot with paganism. It happens a lot with different kind of occultic stuff. I would question the inherent leftist credentials of those things. I certainly like there's a lot of like
For sure.
obviously left-wing anti-fascist pagan groups. I think they're great. But the notion that they are inherently so because they are not Christian, I think misses a lot of that point.
Oh,
And if
for
you look
sure.
at like the actual history of the 19th and 20th century nationalist and romanticist movements, they did take all the bigotries that you found in earlier Christian culture and just sort of they secularized and then put it back into a kind of spirituality. So it's like almost like a religious version of secular white nationalism. And you see that through a lot of that stuff. And a lot of the stuff we're mentioning is about this idea of elevating this personal power, of you becoming powerful, you controlling the material world. I mean, this is what like The Secret and stuff was about, right?
Yeah,
It's
totally.
about like you don't have to be part of the collective. You can step outside of it and you can actually control reality, which again undermines the notion that we have to work together, that there actually is value in equality, that that's actually something that benefits a person. So I
Hmm.
think like all of those things are again about escaping, in a way, the responsibility that being a part of a radical movement has on someone, which is to say, like, you really can't do it on your own. You're going to have to like basically you have to step over your own bullshit and go talk to another person and figure out how to work together. Those are really hard things to do. It's much easier for me to buy goop. Like it's super easy for me to engage in those sorts of things. And it's also consumption framed as morality, because all of those things really are signifiers of class privilege. They really aren't signifiers of performing politics anyway, but they're reframed like they are. So hey, like it's, you know, maybe I couldn't go to that march, maybe I couldn't spend time working on that, but you know what, I can buy organic, you know, maybe that's how I do it. Or maybe I can buy 7th gen cleaning products and, you know, we kind of pay it forward, and, you know, maybe I can take an hour out for meditation, so then I can heal the world by healing myself. It's a very easy way of sort of channeling all those energies back onto yourself. And again, I think people find it unsatisfying because in the end, material conditions do matter. Like stuff outside you does matter. And I think you're going to have to engage with that if you want to see something either practically or spiritually improve.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on board with all of that, and I mean, and it's overcoming a particularly American problem too of like solidarity and working in community and things that have been like kind of bred out of us through the structure of American history for hundreds of years. Our culture is one that's just not about cooperating, and yet at the same time, you see, and this maybe this is an irony of it, but you see like the right cooperating. The right was able to put on their uniforms and go into the Capitol on January 6th and fuck shit up, and they have like some sense of like working together to achieve a common goal. I wonder if we can talk about that evolution because like part of what you're writing about is like from 2014 to today, a lot has changed in terms of accelerating the right. In terms of like you mentioned like, oh well, there's one of these preconditions that people put on fascism. Well, there's not a political party with like a militant adjunct of any kind. But like the Republican Party seems like it's almost there a little bit. There are like armed militias that are around that aren't necessarily Republican Party controlled militias, but it seems like I don't know, the seeds are there for some of that stuff. Can we talk a little bit about like how that's accelerated in the last few years to get us to the moment where like I don't know, January 6th happens and 76 million people are like kind of down with it or down with at least the idea of the big lie.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like something that went from a fringe thing to something much larger.
It's interesting when you look at like polling, not even just polling, but statistical data on far right political parties and their success, like across Europe and stuff. It really doesn't tell the full story of what's actually happening because it leaves out mainstream right-wing parties, which themselves have become radicalized and are sometimes indistinguishable. So, obviously the GOP, Likud in Israel, like those take on these national populist or far right populist tones. And so those are sort of radical vehicles in and of themselves. I think fascist movement has a revolutionary component, and that does undermine the party politics to a certain degree. And the other thing is that the Republican Party is I really shouldn't even say the Republican Party. All major parties are now sort of secondary vessels for whatever activist base wants in there. So, for example, I don't think the Freedom Caucus really sees itself as bound to the Republican Party. I think it tries to make the Republican Party bound to it. I think that's National Conservatives are a really good example of that. And actually, I think that's actually been the way for decades. The far right has always viewed the Republican Party with some suspicion because it doesn't always get them what they want. You see this since the early Goldwater campaign. You see this with like Pat Buchanan's run in 92. You see this with a number of cases where like the Republican Party isn't actually that important. So they are sort of firming up their commitment to far right principles. They are sort of taking it. And in that way, maybe it will coalesce around national conservatives and, their beliefs that vaccines cause autism and whatever else. Right. Like they might coalesce on that, but it's really only in as much as it's useful to them. I think if any of the core conservatives were able to break the hegemony of the Republican Party over conservatism, they would do it gladly. Which is a little different, I think, than Likud. Maybe it's not, but I think it'll bear out. So I think what we're thinking about now, what we should think about is the way that those movements are more fluid than they used to be. It used to be, if we're talking about a fascist political party, you can take down a political party. I mean, like there's a big track record on how to do that. But how do you take down a multitude of people? January 6th is a good example of it because it actually wasn't single organizations. I know the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and stuff are being like indicted and stuff, but the question is, will that really do anything? Because I think what's happening now is most people are unaffiliated. They may be influenced by those groups, but they are unaffiliated, and that makes them like water. I mean, that is what leaderless resistance was about. It was about breaking the ability of law enforcement or other organizations to take down leadership structures, right? Because if you had none, you really couldn't take it down. Instead, if you can figure out a way to effectively communicate with a mass base and get them to do what you want without having like official credo, then that's the sweet spot. And I think that's what they're heading to now.
It's like there is no visible set of leaders, even though there are figures. I mean, it's funny because I'm thinking back to like the Milo era, how long ago that seems. Like when Milo was a big figure in the alt-right, I mean, he's kind of disintegrated now, right? He's not really.
Yeah, definitely disintegrated now.
Yeah. I mean, there was a sense of like, oh, there are going to be these fascist like leaders of some kind. But yeah, the idea. So if it's just this diffuse thing like water, what's uniting these people? What is the kind of underlying value? I mean, to me, I'm in Southern California, so I see a mix of like a lot of like liberal stuff on the back of bumper stickers on the back of cars, and a lot of stuff that's like patriot stuff. A lot of like kind of like Constitution, it seems like it calls to a lot of that kind of founding fathers mythology in part.
I think it does. I mean, I think it's rebranded elements of the same, which was like an extreme cultural conservatism, coveted identitarian policies, basically anti-immigrant stuff, and then various versions of anti-communist frenzy, which is interesting. You know, we're talking about a post-Cold War right. They should be done being scared of the Ruskies, but in a way they're not. I mean, Antifa conspiracy theories are that. BLM conspiracy theories continue that. Also, the race baiting. Anti-immigrant politics is always going to be the centerpiece going forward. I don't see there being a time in which that's not central. And then in a lot of ways, the cultural issues sort of stem from that identitarian center, basically the idea that they are being eroded, like that their identity, which they expect the country to be built on, is being eroded by, you know, queer folks that they're now calling groomers, or CRT, which undermines their kind of like white protectorate, their ability to define the country according to them. So all those things are sort of being centered on that. I think that more than anything, immigration will be the hard line that divides conservatives on this, period. I think it's just period. I think trans issues have become more central to them simply because they're winning on abortion and they can pivot to something else that gets that much guttural anger from their base. So I think those issues will do it, though I do anticipate that immigration, particularly as we're talking about instability in the global south, leading to
I agree. Totally.
higher percent of refugees, they're just going to literally be responding to this. You know,
could see that in the Republican Party with when Lindsey Graham suggested like a national ban on abortion, and Mitch McConnell's like, no, like kind of like trying to keep it quiet and pivot to anti-immigration stuff. And it was right after Lindsey Graham suggested that the Republican Party kind of like didn't really promote his idea, because I know it's not that popular, I don't think. And pivoting to the anti-immigration stuff through the Martha's Vineyard shit and all that sort of thing, which is like, I don't know what you think about that, because Ken Burns was on MSNBC. I think he's doing a documentary on
he did one on the American responses to the Holocaust.
Right. So he basically said that like those buses reminded him of the Holocaust, and he got a bunch of pushback from people who said he was exaggerating. What do you think of that? Because to me, like, that stunt. Like, I get where Ken Burns is coming from, and just talking about like using people as props to make like really racist, xenophobic, anti-immigration points seems pretty fucking ugly to me.
Yeah, no, I don't think he's off base. I mean, you know,
we don't have to talk about Ken Burns as an object,
right? Yeah, I mean, like, whether or not something is like the Holocaust, I think it's a different. But I do see where he's going at, and I don't think he's off base. You know, I think that what's happening now is that the far right has the conditions by which they can take these arguments away. Because I think it's important to understand that like anti-immigrant arguments are a certain type of quote unquote pro-worker argument, right? It's about protecting white American workers, male workers. And so that we are living through the experience of economic crisis. You know, you take the average working class Republican voter, they are not doing well, right? Like, this is not like upwardly mobile. And so the only way that they could actually sell people on right-wing, I mean, no one gives a shit about tax cuts for billionaires and, you know, foreign wars and things. I mean, like, that's just simply not going to motivate them in the same way.
Right.
So I think what they're doing is they're taking the moment in which the left would naturally gain them as a constituency, and they're reframing it in populist narratives. And also remember, like, the liberal left the third way economics has really nothing to offer, you know, like the American worker or something, right? So they're actually being captured from them in that. But yeah, I think, you know, populism does this tricky thing of taking real grievance and basically accelerating it by adding bigotry. You know, not only did you lose your job, you're mad about that, but this person you already didn't like, they fucking took it from you. Like, it's a really, really ugly way of doing that. And so you see this sort of happening where they're basically tacking these sort of stunts onto existing political problems and then watching them just spin out of control. And also, like, we have sort of given the party over to TV. Like, this is not like a new thing. It's been happening for decades, but we have given it over to that performative culture in a way that, like, liberal left never really captured. I mean, MSNBC is boring. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
people, Air America died. Like people don't like on the kind of liberal left don't do that kind of performative
They don't
stunts
do
the same
red
way.
meat in the same way, or they do
No.
red meat and they do it like lame, like they throw like really like lame stuff out that doesn't seem like it has the. I don't know. That's what's scary about the type of populism you're mentioning and the type of fascism you're mentioning, or whatever we want to call it. That sort of like thought that when Tucker Carlson is yelling on TV, part of you is like you understand where he's coming from a material place, and you're fucking terrified because you know a lot of people are going to agree with it. Like that's what to me is like the appeal of fascism to an American population that's already ready to believe a lot of this shit is what's scary to me. Is like it is a kind of Pandora's box in the sense of appealing to, like, it's when someone starts talking about that things are fucked up and that there's things wrong in the society, people are listening, right? And you can fill that void with a lot of things.
I mean, the radical left does get it more,
Right.
but the radical
But
left
where
is
are
not
they?
on TV the way the radical right is. It's just simply not, and so there's no like Tucker Carlson corollary, there's nothing that really matches that. And frankly, here's the thing: even when they try and do it, they replicate the same stuff. Like they'll be like making fun of Trump for being fat or something, as if that's from which his border wall emerged. Or so, like they these performative stunts where they basically try and mimic the cruelty of the right. They do it poorly and it's ineffective and just kind of shitty.
And smug, like it
Yeah,
has a
really
smugness to it.
smug.
Yeah, I mean, we should talk about college a little bit because I feel like college has something to do with this in terms of like how much the right has this distorted vision of what college. You talked about like the Cold War, and like this anti-communist thing, but it seems like a lot of what they're aimed at and a lot of what their vision of American society is this like college educated and college professorial set that has like a outsized influence on American society. And I mean, I've been like an adjunct college professor for many years, and it's just like not anywhere close to what I experience in my classes, particularly in like working class schools.
Or in your
Um,
paycheck.
right, or in my paycheck, or in my labor conditions, etc. So yeah, I mean, it's crazy that they win on that because I feel like conservatives are still sending their kids to college, but college seems like it's still a battlefield.
It's interesting because this is where modern conservatism started, right? So this was
Hmm.
William Buckley's first book, was about creeping liberalism at Yale, right?
Right,
It was
right.
about like this college as this kind of front bellwether. I think what they're picking up on is the notion that metapolitics matter, one, that like culture and things do matter, and that the left has historically been better at that than them. Um, and I think it's also a direct kind of electoral line. Like college education is usually the death throes for the Republican Party. Like it doesn't help them in those ways. I think it's just too good. It's just too good. Huge debt, degrees they think are worthless, things they think distort kind of the smart thinking American worker, and pull them out of their constituency. And they also are able to sort of play on generational divides by doing that. Generations that did go to
Oh,
college,
totally.
generations that
Hmm.
didn't. Because when you look at the reality, if someone has $100,000 of student loan debt and they're an adjunct professor, that's the working class, man. Like that, there's no other way of looking at it. They are making a lot less than a construction worker most times. So, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about American workers or whatever? So, I think
That was the meme that went around yesterday with this. I don't know if you saw this, a construction worker guy, and it was like a guy. It was someone on Twitter that was like saying like, "Oh, this is the working class," and it was kind of like it
right.
was just so outdated. And it's like, I mean, the left does it too in terms of like having a distorted vision of what the working class is, which is kind of crazy, and it kind of makes me think that a lot of the voices on the left are not from the working class or are not in touch with what that life is like. But then, the right likes to think about college students as some like blue haired, transgender, barista, gender studies major. And like, I'm just like that person exists in my school and they're very alone. That's not the mainstream of
and,
American
and they
college
are
students at all.
workers,
Yeah. Mhm.
and they are the working class. I mean, I think, yeah, it's opportunistic. It's the kind of worst version of that. It's them picking on existing bigotries and using it to marginalize a kind of movement class of people. I think on the other point you mentioned on the kind of the left's understanding of the working class. I mean, I think part of it is there has been a lot of culture for a long time of not possessing their own conditions and saying like, I am a working class person who has to fight for my own agency here. There's a lot of like sort of like they're putting their attention on other folks and excuses for kind of not engaging on a personal level.
Hmm.
It's not
Hmm.
my house we're fighting for. It's not my job we're organizing. It's not myself that I feel like I'm defending in this. Instead of understanding, actually, it fucking is you too. It's all of us together. And I think that having that mentality about it, for one, it's not condescending to folks who actually are organizing with, but second, like it actually gives you real tools because now it's
Yeah.
your life is in the fight, you know?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can see that. I mean, it seems like COVID. I mean, I don't think we're the only ones saying this. That COVID seems like it accelerated a lot of these trends, right? And like took things in directions that maybe we didn't expect. But there's there's union organizing going on at places that I didn't really expect. Amazon warehouses and Starbucks and things like that. How do we connect that to? I'm trying to like kind of think about what the left has been up to, and in the Trump years there was there were signs of hope. And the George Floyd protests seemed like they were a sign of hope for people, but it was such a like a one. It seemed like it was just this one perfect moment, that was connected to a lot of different things. But where do we think about in terms of the left as fighting the right? Is union organizing a part of that?
Oh, it's central. It's a
Right.
central. There is nothing more useful than a union to fight almost literally everything the right does. There's nothing more effective in a workplace to defend against transphobia, anti-immigrant violence, all that targeting than having a union and collaborating with your coworkers and talking about why an attack on this trans worker is an attack on you. Like that
Right.
is an
Right.
effective way of doing that. I think there's other, I mean, I think building other organizations like tenant unions do the same thing. I think building, if we're talking about specifically attacks and things, building defensive organizations that protect people, things that have practical goals, like, hey, these people need defense. We need to do it this way. We want to educate and support people. Same thing with mutual aid groups to meet the gap that's not there. All of those things are sort of a future society in utero. They are the sort of
Yeah.
elements that a more liberated society would build. So us doing them now helps us now and it helps us later. So it helps build those things. I think we are going to see more of the sort of perfect moments, quote unquote, these mass actions. And I think it's incumbent on folks that are engaged in long-term organizing to pin them together, like to try and string them together to be more effective, and then to prepare for that reality because it's just different than it used to be.
Yeah.
And so we should just accommodate that. But I think like, organizing is done well when you can tell me what you won. If you can't tell me what you want, you didn't win. I mean, there's just no other way around that. Like you have to actually have victories that can be identified very, very clearly. And so I think reframing all of these issues in ways of how can I organize for that? There's a lot of examples of this where people are trying to figure out what it is. So like, yeah, I think there's a lot of attention on fat acceptance and the movement,
Mm-hmm.
against anti-fat bigotry. And there was a lot of places where it was like not really about material gains. Like people hadn't maybe hadn't quite figured out or they hadn't settled on those things. There are very material things. Like for example, at Whole Foods, I believe still currently, but I know in the past, like folks with a certain BMI and blood pressure rating got less of a discount at work. Like that's a material thing, like
Right.
there is
Right.
like people will be targeted for health insurance differences at work. I mean, those are real material things. So building campaigns around those material things, it changes the cultural focus on it like we want to do. And it has that material anchor to it. Combining those things, I think, is where that sweet spot is for actually getting on these.
Yeah, I agree, and it is a sweet spot. And it does depend on a lot of different I don't know, a lot of different things that seem accidental, but maybe they're not. I think a lot about the Great Depression years and what the left was like during the the 1930s and the 1940s because there was a lot of chaos and there were a lot of amazing labor actions and it was a big transformative time for the left. And I wonder if that's connected to this kind of future that's being born or in utero, I guess is the way you put it. The kind of like mutual aid networks, like and along with unions, and then like where is the Democratic Party in that landscape as well? Because for many years, I was the type of leftist that was like, "Fuck the Democratic Party. They never do anything. We got to build our third party, build another option." Then this other part of me, maybe it's just getting older. I hope I'm not becoming more conservative, but like as I get older, I'm like, well, the Democratic Party is kind of our only bulwark against fascism right now. And that's the kind of thinking that people fell into, the left fell into in the 30s and 40s as well. So I don't know if the 30s and 40s are always the right, maybe historical sort of place to look. But at the same time, it does feel like as economic conditions deteriorate, all of these things come to the fore in terms of options for people to navigate the world.
I think there's two ways to go about confronting an issue, like something major, like not access to healthcare or
Right.
food insecurity, something like really major. You could petition the state in whatever ways that are really effective to get them to basically do that through social spending, taxing the rich, whatever it is, creating infrastructure for that. On the other side, you could just build it yourself. And that might not usually hit the scale that you're talking about with the other one, right? Like,
Right.
if I decide, okay, people don't have access to prescription drugs, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to create factories run by volunteers that make them?
I was about to say that. I was like, how do
Pharmacies?
we, our mutual aid group in Portland, Oregon, how do we make vaccines?
Yeah,
You know, like how do we
right. And
do that?
I think that that's a tough question. The uncomfortable answer is I actually think the second one is the only one that has longevity anymore. There's a couple of reasons. I think one is that I think people really need to remember that when the state gives you something, it can take it right the fuck back too, and it does during periods of austerity. So we saw after the 2008 2009 financial crisis was socialist governments, quote unquote, socialist parties implementing mass austerity.
Sure.
And for years afterwards, cutting retirements, cutting healthcare access, attacking unions. And they were able to do it because independent organizations weren't established to do that work. So even at the best case scenario, you need to have organizations that will constantly hammer the state on this, right? Constantly. But the other thing is, like, those things are collapsing around us. So it wasn't just that the state wouldn't help with the COVID-19 crisis, right? It wasn't just that they chose not to. I mean, they did choose not to, but it wasn't just that. It was also that they no longer had the capacity to do it. People no longer trusted them enough for them to do it. All of the mechanisms by which a state can operate has started to defray. And so when people are building mutual aid networks, they were doing it because it was all that could be done. And I think that's something for us to think about if we're talking about the apocalypse, is in the future, the only thing that will be done is what we do. So building up those sorts of things now is how you survive the apocalypse. It's by diverting all that and filling the empty space made by the state's collapse with your own stuff, basically. There's a long history to draw on, because for a lot of people, I shouldn't say the state didn't exist. The welfare state didn't exist, know?
Right.
So it's like when the Black Panthers were creating survival pending revolution programs, it was because the state was specifically not supporting them. Or when other folks were creating like autonomous organized networks because domestic workers were not being supported and farm workers weren't being supported, right? There was no access to normal state services or housing equity or anything like that. So we know what it looks like, and that's expanding out. There is an equalizing force to capital. It's going to make everybody really worse off, right? And so I think if we want to think back to that idea of apocalypse as an empty space, a fraught empty space that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, but it is empty nonetheless. The question is how you're going to fill it. And so I don't think that people can stop demanding things from the state. I think that is going to have to come with a great deal of direct action alongside it, and the ability to take those sorts of things. And I also think it's worthwhile to remember how revolutions actually play out. And I think this is sort of lost. So take this question of producing vaccines, right? Actually, when revolutions take place, those transfers of mechanisms happen very, very quickly. And so I think, remember that we're talking about building structures of supporting people with also asking yourselves, what's it going to take for us to literally take on this entire operation and to think about that? But what's, I think, useful about the situation we're going through is that we have no fucking choice. It will do it for us. We are being pushed to create those organizations just by fact of circumstances. And ideology doesn't need to even play a prime role in motivating it. In fact, it will be what leftists always kind of say they want, which is that people will have ideological epiphanies from their material conditions. People are engaging in mutual aid networks. They're seeing things collapse. They're seeing their workplace be awful, that they have to organize to fix it. All these sorts of things are happening. And so I think those conditions, that builds that future mechanism. And I think it's what will allow folks to do that second option of building it themselves.
Yeah, taking over those pharmaceutical factories and distributing the vaccines for free. I mean, that's the vision. And I mean, when I think about the January 6th of what were they trying to do? What was if the QAnon shaman had really taken the mechanisms of power there, And part of me is like, it's easy to laugh at this stuff. But the other part of me is like, this is like, it's weird. I think the dialectic of like the cartoonish, funny part of it, alongside the holy shit, this is really happening part of it, is like some sort of weird engine of what's going on. But when I look at January 6th and stuff like that, I wonder, okay, well, what's the left's vision of taking over the state, and what's the right's vision of taking over the state, or dissolving the state, or whatever. I don't know. What do you think of like Joe Biden? Didn't he like directly address the like January 6th people, whatever, by saying like basically like, I hope you got F-16s. You're not gonna like beat us with F-16. Like, to me, like the state still has a pretty hard monopoly on violence, and the police and military are a big element of that. And it seems like I'm not sure exactly how to envision where those forces go in these collapse scenarios, if that makes sense.
I think it's also
they're sort of split institutions, I guess, in some ways.
This goes back to reframing revolution. I think,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's that we are not just talking about challenging the state, like people getting guns together, because that's an ineffective, silly, and frankly, really destructively violent kind of way of thinking about it. People engage in revolution by rebuilding society in a way that challenges its hegemony. And most of the kind of violent history of revolution is actually the violent history of civil wars and competing factions and things like that. It's not actually the process of revolutionary change. It really isn't. And so, yeah, I think like that's sort of part of why the notion of like them challenging the capital, it seems so silly. But I think what's scarier, what you're sort of getting at, is that they won't come at the F-16s, right? Like, they're not actually going to like fight in a fair fight between them, right?
Yes.
No, they're going to, do backhanded stuff. They're going to organize their community. They're going to try and shift local power. They're going to try and storm buildings. I mean, they're going to do things through asymmetrical guerrilla war, right? And that is how they're going to do it. They
even taking over school boards, and like, actually seizing power that way, in like a halfway legitimate way, even if they're going to claim that elections are stolen and stuff like that. They do want those judges. They do want a Trump Supreme Court. Like, they still want to be able to smash us legally.
I mean, a successful revolution for them will take the appearance of them simply defending the country from us.
Right.
Right. They don't have to ever be presented as the offense. In fact, far right movements almost always justify their violence by saying, "Hey, we're just here to protect you from these insurgents over here." I mean, Nazis came in to protect you from the communists, which are just about to overthrow, and they're going to kill you, and they're coming after you. So I think that they will never challenge the state in a head-on fashion, because that's not how that works. It ends up being, I think, a straw man. For like when Biden says that kind of thing, it's sort of a straw man. The other thing about it too is that he's sort of like valorizing liberal law enforcement, like this idea that they will solve the problem. And this is like a really, I don't know, uncomfortable people, because I think people like seeing their enemies taken down by proxy. They don't like the FBI until it takes their enemies out. But the reality is that the FBI maintains unequal structures, and they're more likely to be used against marginalized folks than they are against.
That's
the
tough,
right.
Man.
So
when the cops were beating the shit out of the MAGA people at the end of that day, a part of me was like, had a little smirk on my face, and I'm the type of self-critical person. It's like, oh fuck, like, don't be happy about that, because that's the wing of the state that comes after the left more often than the right. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, is anyone going to stop this shit? How come the police will come out to some fucking college protest and pepper spray unarmed students? But the right gets to fucking parade around and open carry AR-15s everywhere and threaten everybody, and the cops never confront them. So when the cops finally do confront them,
because the cops are already there.
They're the same people. Yeah, I understand all that. But like, at the same time, I mean, you're kind of like, well, how do we stop these people? It can't be us Antifa warriors getting in the garage and like, working out and getting ready to like fight those guys on the street. I've seen those street fights. I know you've written about them. And like, to me, I'm like, that's the last thing I want to do, is go fucking fight some dude, that's got an AR-15 on him. Like, that shit's like, it's freaky. And it seems like, I don't know, part of me is like trying to wrap my head around, is that the future, or is that some like sideshow to American life? And like, it seems like those little skirmishes happen, and then we go off and we like sort of do our YouTube channels about it for a few years, and then we come back and battle again. I don't know. It's a world that's been there, and it's kind of watching it, and I know we're kind of in the nascent stages of it in some ways. It's like, it's an ingredient in the weird reality we're in, I guess.
I mean, I think, defending folks against the far right is useful and important, but that's not really what the work has done of really changing the fundamental conditions of our society, right? That's a
Yeah,
stopgap measure,
right.
right? I think that the work that actually challenges the state is building mutual aid networks that no longer need the state. I mean, I think it's literally organizing folks so effectively that it is able to challenge some of those fundamental assumptions that we give over to power that we otherwise don't venerate. So I think that's where the work happens really, and like what anti-fascism and stuff is that protectorate that's going to be necessary, and it's going to be increasingly necessary because like the crisis that's coming or is already here for some people and coming for others, the right has an answer for it, right? They have a very cogent answer for it, and so if we don't stop them, they will take that energy and they will use it in their direction. And so it's up to us to actually stop that from happening. That's an anti-fascist force, and then to build the alternative alongside it.
And their plan is, I mean, it seems like climate apocalypse is going to, like, I was thinking that borders are a mechanism of that, right? And borders are going to be the mechanism of people, it's already happening, of people being put into massive camps. And you just have this, we call it the planet of camps, but like this, tens of millions of people in those places. And it seems like the right will not only sort of justify and provide the ideological basis for that project, they're also going to appeal to a lot of like working class liberals, people who are also like, we don't want these people here. That part of it seems like a massive barrier to overcome in the future, is figuring out how we're going to create humanity for people that are stateless or people that are like caught in this border crisis or whatever. I don't know what the left's attitude needs to be about that, because it seems like the left's attitude on immigration is all over the place.
I mean, it has to be for the total abolition of borders, because borders, I mean, for one, the border is everywhere, right? Because the border is an experience of marginalization that people face. So it's not just along that border. Obviously, that needs to be eradicated. But the concept of borders itself has to fundamentally go. There's no liberated society that includes a border. There's a great book by Rhys Jones called White Borders that came out, I think, last year. It made the point that the border is an inherently violent concept. So a society that doesn't want to be inherently violent can't have borders. I mean, I think it's so black and white like that. And so that needs to be the standard of it. And I think that's in a way where we're getting our strength. Remember, like the right uses money for the strength. They use minority power to wield it. But the more folks that we are working with that experience that marginalization, that's folks coming across the border, folks experiencing the border here, uniting with workers and other marginalized folks here in the US, that gives us strength with numbers. So I think that having that be the foundation of how we approach this is entirely necessary. And also, these folks are coming in. Frankly, there is a certain amount, I don't like to overstate this because I think it gets overstated a lot, but there's a certain amount of kind of like affluent unaccess to self-preservation of like, people growing up haven't had this. Some people haven't had to struggle and build those solutions. A lot of people coming in have done that, and we actually should be collaborating with them because they have things to teach us. We need to be sharing in that. That's the vision of a liberated future. I mean, it's not a liberated future if it doesn't include all of us. So I think like we have to think 100% about prioritizing the eradication of the border and the end to border criminalization.
And I don't know where that finds its place in the Democratic Party, because I mean, you as well as I remember that for 4 years of Trump, it was just Democrats saying there are kids in cages, there are kids in cages, there are kids in cages, and like Michelle Obama making videos where she's crying about this, etc., and then just fucking silence as soon as a Democrat is president. It seems like that there's a real skepticism or fear of the Democratic Party machine of engaging with border politics at all. It's certainly in the way that you're talking about. I mean, it's a radical. The open borders politics to me are such radical idea, and yet at the same time they seem like, in my mind, I agree with you, like they're just carcerality and they're the evidence of a prison planet, and the only way we're going to survive is by disintegrating that mindset. At the same time, I'm like, we're entering a time of like war and protectionism and nationalism all over the world. And I wanted to mention, Shane, before you go, that you have a book that's about kind of the global element of this. Can you talk a little bit about your new book? It's called No Pasarán. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an anthology. It has, I think, 25 chapters. It's got a ton of great folks. It's got Tal Levin, Kim Kelly, David Renton, Geomar. It's a lot of really good folks. And so it takes like a bunch of different approaches, talks about a different kind of like identity experiences, different regions, different histories. And it's all across the map. It's one of the, I think, like the biggest swath of writing I've ever seen about kind of subject brought together. I think what you're saying here is important because the reality is that what the right is doing when it talks about the border and things is it's trying to take economic anxiety, and channel it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to show that actually our economic anxiety is actually better when we work across borders with other workers and build that kind of power. And I think when it comes to anti-fascism, we also need to show people that this is something that benefits all people who do not want to be crushed by the right. Like that's an essential piece. We don't survive without it. We simply don't. And so instead of like these kind of convoluted leftist critiques, I think it's useful to think, how can we improve those things? How can we work together? How do they collaborate with other social movements? Those are the sorts of questions. The Democratic Party is not a workers' party, obviously. And there's like a couple ways I think the left engaged with it. One is to try and push really left-wing candidates through like DSA or something to try and get in there and represent our interests. And I think the other one is to say, like, what can they get us? Can we give something? And can what we get help our actual organizing? Like if they pass a legislation that helps labor unions organize more effectively, that helps us build independent organizations. It doesn't just rely on the state to, pump money into like a program. So I think like it's useful to think like, what can we do to build up our independent organizations to fight? I think those are the questions we should be asking.
Yeah. We have homelessness in our town, in that's become a sort of issue for the right and left. And it seems like it's attached to all of this. It's kind of like the perception of like who's in and who's out in society, and who's a human being. And it seems like some of that has to come out of economic anxiety, and some of it is just like our town is being ruined by all these people and tent cities everywhere. There's like, I don't know. That's, to me, it's like if the left doesn't own that language, then it's very easy. It feels like the American mind can slide down to fascism very easily, and it's like a harder climb to go up to left-wing values, if that makes sense. And it's kind of a clunky metaphor, but it feels like the left has to be active on that issue in a way that, I don't know, speaks to ordinary people's concerns about it. And I'm not sure what that is. I don't know if it's like defund the police. I don't know if it's abolish the police. I don't know what kind of language it is that works, but it seems like that's a critical element in it, and I'm not exactly sure how we talk to those people that are already, on that slide, but it seems like it's part of the effort.
I mean, the reality is that all the people complaining about this have more in common with their neighbors in tents than they do the politicians that are telling them to blame them.
Right, but they don't see it that way at all, right?
I think that's the conversation we have to start having with people about what does it take to win something. Well, bottom line is you're going to need that person in the tent, and you're going to need your other neighbor, and you're going to need all these people. And rich people have never offered you a solution that's going to fix it. It just simply is not possible. I mean, it's sort of absurd thing that we're living in, where billionaires call themselves populists, and then force the left to answer for why they aren't speaking for the working class. It's sort of like everything flipped on its head. But I think building up that conversation about what it takes to win things, to solve solutions. If you don't like tent cities, then work to get people fucking homes. Like this is not a confusing process. That's more effective than trying to use sweeps to clear them out and just push them somewhere else. Like even if your only interest isn't people's humanity, and it's just your self-interest, then there's more effective ways to do that by working with those people. And I think letting people understand that, like, actually, people do take your concerns serious, and we have approach. We think that working with folks across these lines, that's going to do it. I think because that's factually true. Like that's an evidence-based approach to solving the problem. Is working in those across different kind of marginalized groups together, and not collaborating with the rich.
Yeah. I mean, the rational element of it, though, is so obscured often from this emotional, sentimental engagement with politics that people have. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, people look at Trump as a populist and as someone that's like one of us, which is just an incredibly irrational thing to conclude. And yet, I think you write about really well in your books about how fascism is this sort of like amorphous thing that takes place in a lot of different areas of society, including pop culture and the kind of language we use to describe things. I don't know. I grew up in Southern California, like I said, and in the 80s and 90s, and it was anti-immigrant politics, where like the conservative thing. I mean, Prop 187, I've mentioned a couple times that watching a bunch of football players at my high school burn a Mexican flag during like lunchtime. There was sort of like this like racist white high school kids around when I was young. And it seems like that attitude has only grown and grown more deeply entrenched in the Republican Party, and it's everywhere. But it was racist too. It wasn't just like these were middle class kids, and what I heard from them often was just like cultural resentment. Everything's in Spanish now. There are Mexicans everywhere. That was the landscape of race when I grew up where I'm from. And the larger story, of course, is that there are quote unquote Mexicans here because this is an agricultural town. And if you knew what the kind of labor conditions are here, you'd understand that these are like people that are coming here for very particular reasons, and they're part of this economy, etc. It's a huge conversation. But my point is people see it so like culturally and emotionally, and it feels like that's a place where the left has to hit as well, not just the rational. That's my.
I think the labor movement does hit an emotional level. I think that there is a way of doing that, of sharing about those shared conditions. Because if you can tell people's stories in a way that people say, "Oh yeah, that's sort of my story too," even though the experiences, there's a lot of differences. I think that does speak to those sorts of things. I think also like it, just to be blunt, like people fucking hate the rich. They really do. And I think like not allowing rich people to duck out of that culturally by rebranding themselves or acting, because all Trump is basically best friend boss. It's sort of like getting people to gladly accept their power and control. I think building that sense of autonomy and building the idea that your power does come from collaboration with other folks. Those Mexican immigrant folks are more like you than you are like Trump or like the people who own the farms that they work on.
Well, I'm glad you said that, and I think that it's something that just in the 30 years since I went to high school, 25 years since I had high school in this town has changed. I teach college here. There are people that are like mixed families here. There's much more like of an integrated. There's like, and in other words, there's like a sort of like material mixing of cultures that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in Southern California that I feel like is a little bit of a basis of what you're talking about, of kind of like finding solidarity beyond just like these sort of others. And like, I know that's like, we can get academic language of like the other and everything like that, but it really does seem key to like see people as brothers and sisters or see people as, threats, and mitigating that sort of division is going to be a key question in the future. And you write about it so well, Shane. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
I mean, loving kindness is what bonds people together in a much more lasting, real, sincere way. And I think like people having the chance to experience that is really transformative. I mean, that's what an organizing relationship is largely built on. It's built on this kind of this shared experience, this compassion between people that produces something, And I think that people don't have that experience. For a lot of people, there is no non-commercial way they interact with a community. They're not members of churches. They're not, for the most part, not members of labor unions. They're not even members of the Elks Club. They don't have that sense of relationship. But when you give people that's a total game changer. That entirely changes their universe. I think that some of the most radical pieces of like a revolution is building a change collectively in that shared approach to community. That's a major change for people. And I think actually the more big changes happen more rapidly once those seemingly small changes are enacted.
Totally, dude. It's making me think of this moment. I think it's in Howard Zinn's People's History, where he quotes a letter from like a slave owner's wife who's like part of the plantation business, and she's writing about watching these laborers, enslaved people, do a project on their property, and it's a mix of laborers that are Irish and African, and she says they're talking to each other. And she's writing to her husband, who's like away on business somewhere. And she's saying, I don't know if we should have this arrangement where Irish immigrants are in the same pits working with African slaves, because they're starting to like laugh together and like have she was basically saying they're like becoming bonded. And God, when I think about like the state like crushing unions over the last, forever, but like especially in the erasing unions from the kind of fabric of working class life, it does seem like in part a way to sort of do that is get in the way of those sorts of bonds. Beyond all the like, oh, they're going to get better benefits and wages and things like that, there's also like a danger in people seeing each other as being in common. You make me think some really I don't know, some really deep stuff about where we're headed, Shane. Your books are really interesting. I wanted to thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I was happy to.
Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Shane Burley, for coming on the program. Go check out his stuff. His latest book is called Why We Fight, Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse. Go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. We got all sorts of stuff going on there. Patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. All these links are in the episode description. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.